And joining us today for the pundits, we have Kevin Richert of Idaho Education News, former Idaho Supreme Court Justice Jim Jones, Seth Ogilvie of Idaho Public Television, and Betsy Russell of the Idaho Press. Seth, I wanted to start with you. We just saw your investigation, and I want to know, you've been working on this for weeks. What stood out to you the most over the course of this reporting?
Well, and first off, it wasn't just me. Our associate producer, Devin Downey, went through a lot of records with me. We sent out a lot of information requests. So it's not just me, it takes a village, much like school safety.
A village of two, and you two have done a phenomenal job.
I did. I think that what surprised me the most was how counterintuitive a lot of these things is. When you talk to the researchers, they'll tell you that, first off, when you just see the media responses to certain events, oftentimes they're not right. And we always forget that there's an after-action report that's going to tell us what actually happened, and that's what you really try to base the new training, the new data on. But in a lot of these things are so based on emotion because you want to do what's right. And when you add in the idea that some of the training is counterintuitive, it really becomes hard to do the right thing, because oftentimes the people in the community are demanding something that is actually going to do the opposite. So that puts stress on the system. I think that was kind of the most surprising thing that I found, that I didn't obviously jam into the amount of time that I put on this package in the show.
So that's interesting, because you highlighted students. You interviewed students last year during the walkout who were saying, we need action, we need something done right now. So I'm hearing two different things, that leaders need to listen to these students and do something, but also not necessarily listen to the students and parents because their reactions are based on emotion?
Well, it's not that they shouldn't respond to them. They absolutely should. It's that sometimes you'll see, like I think the instance, there was a shooting, I can't remember, it was Sandy Hook or one of the other ones, where everyone thought, oh, he pulled the fire alarm to get people to come into the halls. And a lot of schools based policy off that. What it turned out is the shooting from the gun actually triggered the fire alarm. It had nothing to do with what's going on there. So like certain policies started to be created based on something that didn't happen, because it was spread around the news media that this happened. A school district started making decisions. They didn't wait for the professionals and the experts to come in and actually be like, here's what you should do. And I think in Idaho, what I was trying to highlight is a lot of these decisions are left up to superintendents, to school districts, and they're trying to make decisions based off what they know. Oftentimes, they're not an expert. Unlike Andy Grover, they didn't do their dissertation on school safety. So they need to make these decisions without maybe all the best information. They can reach out, obviously, to the Office of School Safety, but they need to reach out.
Because it's not required that they do. I just have to note that it's grim that you couldn't remember which school shooting was which.
It is grim.
Kevin, I wanted to get your take on what's going on the state and legislative level. What are you seeing?
Well, I think, to Seth's reporting, I think in the big picture, what you have here is an issue that what makes it such an emotional issue, what makes it such a visceral issue, also makes it a really difficult issue to solve from a public policy standpoint. I mean, everybody wants to get this right, and nobody wants to be the person who says, if we'd only done this, it could have been prevented. But I think you've seen the legislature, I think they kind of dismissed Superintendent Ibarra's KISS proposal fairly quickly, because for a lot of reasons. It wasn't rolled out very well, the timing wasn't very good. The timing of asking for $18.5 million of one-time grant money in this revenue picture, in this revenue situation for the state, very difficult. But I think even stripping away from all of that, I think it would have been difficult for the legislature to look at that and say, this is the way we spend money that's going to prevent a problem. I get the sense really that legislators are going to be wrestling with what's the right thing to do here for quite a while.
And I think what we saw in the public policy survey the other day is a lot of times people don't want certain parts of education taken away from other parts of education. And it really seems with the budget going the way that it is, that might be what happened. That $18 million might come out of some sort of other educational program.
And what you said about how a lot of this is counterintuitive. I mean, I listened to Brian Arms this week presenting to the Senate Education Committee and talking about some of his findings. And when you hear 27% of schools have an SRO, taking away the training issues, which are very serious, 27% of schools have an SRO. You look at that number and you say, my goodness, we're really behind the curve. But Arms will say, it's not always warranted, and it's not always the right approach to put an SRO in every school building across the state. It's not necessarily the right answer, even though it sounds like the politically correct and politically expedient answer.
But a lot of those school districts do want those SROs. But of course, you got to come up with funding for that.
Right,
Yeah.
and that's not just a rural issue. I mean, we heard from Troy Rohn, who's a Boise school trustee, who was sitting in Senate Education this week, saying we have to split an SRO between two schools right in the middle of Boise.
And a lot of those schools, the 27%, are sharing with another school
Yeah.
district.
Right.
And that gets me to the other thing that, as we move into funding, that I thought was really interesting, is we're moving to a funding formula model that goes to a student rather than a school district. One of the major things
Proposed, right.
one of the major things I found with school safety is that a lot of the districts train kids differently. They have different ways in which they go through lockdown procedures. Kids are mobile now. Kids aren't staying in the same district the entire time. So when that kid gets his school safety training in Melba and then moves to Meridian and maybe something happens there, he doesn't know the procedures, or she doesn't know the procedures there, which does kind of lead you to believe that some sort of at least base uniform policy might keep kids safe as they move from district to district.
Well, and you just brought up the funding formula, and we got the first look at that draft legislation this week. Kevin, we're already seeing some tensions and divisions around that proposal.
It's very pronounced, and it was starting to come to a head even before the release of the draft legislation on Thursday. Superintendents in the Treasure Valley, who taken together are instructing close to half of the students in the state, they feel like they've been locked out of this process, locked out of the drafting process, to the point of the Boise School District submitted this really far-reaching public records request to the Bonneville School District to try to tease out any kind of information that they could get about what the funding formula bill might look like, what the dialogue about the funding formula bill looks like. So this is going to be a very, very contentious issue as the bill starts to, circulate around the state. I think, and it's impossible, I think, at this point to predict how legislators are going to deal with this, because they're going to hear a lot from their local educators, and not all of it's going to be good.
And it's a 58, 59-page bill.
There's
right?
a lot there to digest, and a lot of that is kind of bringing code into compliance with a new formula, but the meat of it is you are changing the way you may spend upwards of $1.5 to $2 billion a year of education funding, depending on how much you fold into this formula and what this formula looks like. I mean, the stakes are enormous.
And there's not really a carrot that comes along with it. With a lot of the major school policy changes that we see, you get some money in addition to it. I mean, they're saying that they're going to hold some school districts whole for the 3-year period, but at the end of the day, it's not like the career ladder or something like that, where there's a 5-year plan. We're going to show you that we're going to put this much more money and this much more money, so you can be like, oh, that's going to work out for me at the end. Now we just have, it's inherently human to kind of have a little bit of fear when it comes to change.
Jim, I wanted to bring you in on this because school funding has been a contentious issue in Idaho for a long time, and there has long been a question as to whether or not Idaho is meeting that constitutional requirement to provide uniform education to Idaho children, because as we've seen, rural districts especially are struggling to fund basic functions of that district. I wanted to get your thoughts on how far Idaho has come, how far we still have left to go, and whether you think that this might go anywhere to solving that.
Well, I think that you have to put more money into the system. If you do that, you're going to maybe smooth out some of these wrinkles between the urban and rural districts. But we're not meeting the obligation under the Constitution to provide a uniform and thorough system of public education. I think to do that, you have to try to do as much as you can to provide equity among rural and urban districts. But in the final analysis, you have to look at whether you're giving kids in this area and that area and this area an equal opportunity to get an education that they can put to use. And I think that we've been hamstrung by not having enough money overall to go around.
And Betsy, it seems like there really are two different conversations going on here: how to divvy up the money and how much money to put in the first place.
And really that goes back to what Justice Jones was talking about. If there's not enough money, then no matter how you divvy it up, there are going to be losers. There are going to be districts that don't have enough to do what they basically have to do. And this whole situation really was exacerbated by the 2006 change when Jim Risch was governor, and he called a special session and he took the bulk of school operations funding off the property tax. That had been a very stable source of funding for schools, and it went onto the sales tax, which goes up and down with the economy, and we have since had major debates about how we adequately fund our schools. On the other hand, this issue stretches back even before that. Some of the research that Mike Ferguson did showed that our investment in schools has actually been dropping for decades compared to what our total resources and what we could be contributing. And then we hear from legislators who say, well, nearly half of our state budget goes to public schools. Isn't that enough? And I think from what we're seeing, the answer is no, it's not enough.
You know, money solves a lot of political problems. So in 1994, the last time the state redid its school funding formula, with that came a 17% increase in public school spending that year. I don't think we're going to see a 17% increase in public school spending if we implement the funding formula next year or 2 years down the road or whenever this would be implemented. That's the rub here.
And it seems like money has just kind of consistently been coming out. The Washington Post actually did a really interesting analysis of teacher salary the other day, where if you go back to, I think it was 1990, you have 26 states that pay teachers at about the average level of salary. Now it's down to one, just Rhode Island.
So briefly, we touched on the Supreme Court case, the oral arguments, Regan v. Denny, earlier in the show. But now that we have a former Supreme Court justice on the panel, I wanted to get your thoughts, because this is a case that you have been following.
Yes. Well, I can't, with great certainty predict how the new court is going to rule, but I would be surprised if we didn't come out with a decision that says, yes, the petitioners have standing to bring the issue to the court. It's a question that we can address, and they don't have a case. That's kind of what I'm thinking. Essentially, if you follow their line of argument, it's not just a little bit of an increment in the coverage of people under Medicaid. They would do away with Medicaid altogether. And I just don't see that the court is going to rule that way. It's just a matter of making a little adjustment to a program that's been in effect for years. And this idea that, well, we're stuck with it into eternity just ain't going to sell. I mean, if the state wants to, if the conditions get too onerous or they're putting in too much money, they can cut it off, or they can get a waiver. They can do any number of things, but it's not like you're stuck in a black hole and you can never get out.
Interestingly, Wayne Hoffman, the president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, which brought the lawsuit, wrote in his column this week that Medicaid is socialism. And he wasn't just talking about Medicaid expansion. So I think the justice is correct, and that's the direction they're going.
And I'd be curious, Justice, if they ruled that this was unconstitutional, the implication would be that maybe Medicaid would be unconstitutional. Like, what federal programs would we have left at that point?
Well, we have a lot of synergy between state legislation and federal programs. We hook into the income tax. There are just any number of programs
Minimum
that
wage,
if you followed that followed their logic, we would essentially have to withdraw from the union.
So no small ramifications.
which has come up before, so let's be clear. In the news this week on a national level, a lot of people have been talking about Ted Bundy because of a Netflix documentary series that has come out, as well as a dramatization, a movie that will be forthcoming as well. You were Attorney General in 1989 when Ted Bundy was executed and when he confessed to an Idaho murder, and two of your investigators actually interviewed Ted Bundy.
Right. Yeah, they went down to talk to him. There was some talk that there was one person murdered in Idaho and possibly more. He did indicate to them that yes, there had been one murder in Idaho. He was coy about any others. He provided some details, but I don't know that it ever helped to close the case. He apparently was quite charming, an intelligent guy, but my chief investigator, Russ Renaud, said that you could just tell that this was a guy that was cold as a stone.
Sure.
You know, he didn't have any emotion in his eyes, and you know, you could see that he would be, you know, guilty of a lot of atrocities.
Well, and the murder he confessed to was of a 12-year-old girl named Lynette Culver. But to be clear, there are also a lot of other missing women who went missing around that time. I'm curious, in your view, since the 70s and 80s, when Ted Bundy was really in the news so much, to now in 2019, how far have we come in protecting women against violence, whether it's from predators like Ted Bundy or domestic partners?
I think we've made some progress. I mean, it's come up on people's radar. You have a lot of people who are involved in trying to do something about the issue. The court has a domestic violence court program that works with perpetrators. The problem is you don't want them to get into the system in the first place. And so you've got to do much more in a preventive vein. I think if you can keep guns out of the hands of people who have been involved in domestic violence, it's going to be a help. But I think that there needs to be more public involvement, community involvement, to say this is not acceptable conduct. And I don't know that we've reached that point. But I think we're moving in the right direction.
We have about a minute left. What is going to have to change on a societal level to really have a serious conversation and make that kind of change that you're talking about?
I think we're moving in that direction. You know, when the court here in Ada County first tried to get a domestic violence court going, they announced it, and you know, it didn't get off the ground real well. But then they started bringing in employers, you know, and the employer says, I'm not going to put up with this. If you abuse your wife or your girlfriend, you're not going to have a job. And they brought in people who could be counselors and people who would spread the word. And I think that's been very helpful, and I think it needs to spread out from the court system to the society in general.
All right. Well, Jim Jones, Kevin Richert, Seth Ogilvie, and Betsy Russell, happy birthday, by the way. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for watching. We'll see you right back here next week.